Welcome to the audio lecture on the art and culture of the Pacific Islands. Now, as we look at the art of this particular part of the world, it's really striking to me at how this artwork is so influenced by the environment in which the people lived. Here we see the influence of the desert, and then in other art we see the influence of the ocean, as they lived so entwined with the natural world. And yet, also at the same time, we'll be looking at the profound influence of Western colonization upon these cultures. Now, specifically, what we will be looking at is Australia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. So let's go and talk first about what happened when Captain Cook arrived in the year 1788. Now, at the time of this explorer's arrival, he came from England, and he arrived on the Australian continent. At that time, it was already home to at least 300,000 indigenous Australians, and they had made this place their home for 50,000 years. They spoke over 250 languages, and they had been creating rock art for over 40,000 years. This is actually the oldest continual culture on Earth. So in spite of all of this, good old Captain Cook, he claimed it for Britain, calling it a terra nullius, which means a place owned by no one. So this led to what you could typically expect in the trajectory that we've seen in other parts of the world. Within a few decades, diseases had killed over half of the indigenous people. Next, we have colonization and the arrival of missionaries that forever changed the way of life of these people, these ancient Australians. It changed their way of life forever. So let's fast forward about 200 years. And this statement was written. It's called the Barunga Statement. I encourage you to find a way to actually read the text of this statement because it's quite profound. It was presented to the Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and it was inspired by an early document, and basically what it does is it claims indigenous rights for the people who are the oldest inhabitants of Australia. So the earlier document had been written on bark. It had been submitted about 25 years earlier with the same purpose of claiming indigenous rights. These documents were submitted to the Australian Parliament. So here what we have in this document is on the left-hand side, it's traditional artwork from Arnhem Land, which is in the Northern Territory of Australia. And on the right, we have artwork that is typical of the Central Desert people. So this is a fun document to look at in that it's split right down the middle, and we see the variety of cultural expression and artistic expression in front of us, and yet they are unified in this document demanding their rights. So it did have some effect. In the year 1992, 204 years after the land was claimed as inhabited by no one, that was annulled. The concept of terra nullius was voided by the High Court of Australia, and rights were granted. However, there was no treaty that followed. There was no legislation to actually put the rights into practice. And so the indigenous leader asked for this Barunga Statement to be returned. Now what this actually is it's a collage on illustration board with the statement printed in the middle. So the indigenous leader asked for the statement to be returned, for this work of art to be returned, so that he could bury it and lay it to rest. However, in true colonization fashion, that didn't happen, and it still hangs in Parliament to this day. But maybe that's ultimately for the best, because it serves as a reminder of the indigenous people and their rights that they have as simply being inhabitants of their native land. And still, the rights and property for indigenous people is still up for debate, and it's a very active topic in Australia. Now, we can look also at New Zealand, which had a completely different trajectory, because way back in the year 1840, there was a treaty was drawn up between the native Maori people and the British. and it granted these indigenous folks land rights and all the rights of the British citizens. So here we have these two land masses that are relatively close together, but because of treaties, or lack of treaties really, they have a completely different experience as human beings with rights in their own countries. So where exactly are we talking about when we talk about islands of the Pacific? As you can see in this map, this area is defined by the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is huge water mass, and it actually takes up a third of the land mass of the entire Earth. We have the great land masses of Asia on one side and of the Americas on the other side, and this vast ocean in the middle. And in addition to Australia, there's all these small islands that are scattered. Now, the distinctions of Australia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia were really put in place by Europeans, but they can be useful to help define what it is that we're actually talking about. When ocean levels were lower, these land masses were larger, and actually Tasmania and New Guinea, here and here, they were all one land mass. But as ocean levels rose, and at the end of the last ice age, then there was more ocean, and these people developed great seafaring abilities. The first settlers came from Southeast Asia about 50,000 years ago, we're pretty sure, and about 7,000 BC, the people of Melanesia started raising pigs. They became Neolithic. They farmed, they formed village clusters, and they settled. However, on the mainland of Australia, the Aboriginal Australians, they stayed hunting gathering. They remained a hunting gathering society until well into the 20th century. Now, there was a people called the Lapita, and they settled much of the rest of these islands. They are the people that they made these beautiful ceramics, and we will look at those ceramics here. Note the distinctive style with the dots and the patterning, and this is something that we see throughout the region. And because these early explorers they probably used the double-hulled canoes, and they went from island to island and left these ceramics, these shards. It tells us about how far and wide they really did travel to settle the islands. This is from about 1200 BC. One other thing that's very interesting to note as we look at the different islands is that they are made from two very distinct geological forms. Some of them are volcanic in origin, and that means that the earth is pretty rich, that there's plenty of stone or obsidian to make tools from, and that the people have a fairly easy life. Now, some of the other islands are atop coral atolls, and in this case, the land really does not offer much in the way of fertile ground, and there's not really that much to make tools out of. So in this case, the people do live more entirely off the ocean, and they have a little bit of a more challenging existence. This is what we see in our when we look at the historical artifacts of these two different kinds of geological formations that made up the islands. The original inhabitants of the continent of the land mass of Australia were hunter-gatherers, and as such they were very closely attuned to the natural world. They held a deep and intimate knowledge of the plants, the animals, the water sources, and the only modification that they made to the natural world was periodic burning that allowed for fresh plant life to come through. The primary spiritual belief of the Aboriginal people of Australia was a concept called dream time. Now, this is very different than we go to sleep and we dream. The dream time, rather, refers to the time before we existed and the time beyond which we exist in. It's a kind of a mystical concept, but it also dates back to their origin story. So, in this origin story, at the beginning, the world is a flat, featureless place. And eventually, ancestral beings emerge from the earth or arrive from the sea, and they take many forms. As these spirit beings cross the continent, they create features such as mountains, rivers, waterholes, and they also created plants and animals and humans and created rituals, also providing the sacred objects to be used in these rituals. The dream time rituals remain secret, and they remain active to this day. People who follow this religion, they believe that dream time still exists, that the dreaming is still going on, and that in a way we are still dreaming our reality into existence. As a result, it's difficult to know all the details of what the meaning is behind these works of art. But here's one that we know a little bit about, and it was created by a man named Jimmy Midjaw in the middle of the 20th century. So it is painted in the traditional way on an ochre-colored piece of bark, and this is how these paintings have been painted for millennia. So what we see here are called the mimi, and they live in the cracks between the rocks during the day, but they come out at night and they work their magic. So here's a story of the mimis carrying out their nighttime activities. As we explore the cluster of islets known as Melanesia, we see a very different expression of how they lived, because these societies were agricultural, at least in part, as compared to the hunter-gatherer societies that we do see on the Australian mainland. And in Micronesia, they did settle into permanent settlements, because that's what you do when you farm. There were spaces set aside for ritual use within the settlements, and that's what we're looking at here, is a men's house, a place for sacred ceremonies to be held, and you really had to be a male warrior in order to enter this place. So social position and status were not inherited in the Melanesian societies in general, like we saw in Africa. Whereas in Africa, you would inherit the rulers would inherit their position. Here, they were gained, achieved by accumulating wealth, which is usually reflected in the number of pigs that the people had, but also by demonstration of leadership abilities and by participation in men's societies. This is a very patrilineal society, and as in most male-dominated societies, the women had their place, and it was an important place, but most of the main decisions were made, at least externally, by the men. These men's societies would hold rituals, and their ceremonies often involved masks and body decoration. And women, on the other hand, would be the audience to these ceremonies, and they were also fine artisans, creating bark cloth, pottery, and other beautiful objects. Now we'll move over to New Guinea and talk a little bit about that island, which happens to be the second largest island on Earth. It's 1,500 miles long and about 1,000 miles wide, which leaves me with the question is, when does it go from being an island to simply a landmass? But that's for another day. New Guinea is divided into two countries. We have Eastern Papua New Guinea, which is an independent country, and then we have Western Papua New Guinea, which is a province of Indonesia. On this island, there is a real diverse geography. Over 750 languages are spoken among the surrounding islands and the large island of New Guinea itself. There's coastal communities, and then there's mountains which go, high into the sky and have rainforests and their own geography. Often they're shrouded in mist, and the temperatures are somewhat temperate. So here we're looking at another ceremonial men's house. This one is from the Abalam people. They live in the foothills of northern Papua New Guinea. And they're farmers, much like we saw in Melanesia. They raise pigs and taro and all of that, but they have a real specialization and an honoring of yams. In fact, the men's cults are yam cults, and there's an honoring of who can grow the biggest yam. They even have a yearly yam festival. Now, in general, they live in extended families or clans, and each family will have its own hamlet. In this hamlet, they have sleeping houses, cooking houses, yam storage houses, and this what they call the karambo, or the spirit house. Now, the building of the spirit house is quite an endeavor and can only be done by initiated men. Once the house has been indoctrinated, or once it's finished and they've had the final rituals, only initiated men of the Yam cult will be allowed to enter. While men express their creative abilities through decorating the facade of the men's sacred ceremonial houses, women do it in a more practical sense. And here we have one of the most common ways that a woman will be artistic in this society in New Guinea. These are called the bilam, and they're basically net bags. So they fulfill a very practical function in that one could obviously carry fruit or vegetables or whatever was necessary in the bags, but they also have a ceremonial function. After a man dies, his bones will often be put in one of these bags and hung in the ceremonial hut. And the way that a woman wears a bag will reflect whether she's eligible for marriage or not. In some of the cultures of New Guinea, it's part of an expression of a woman's beauty, really, how she wears the bag. Now, while these were originally used by just a few of the peoples of New Guinea, now they've become a sort of a national symbol. And they're made for the tourist trade. They're no longer just made of the bark that they were originally woven from, but they're made from all sorts of fibers. Yet the design and the method for making them remains the same. These are the spirit poles that are carved by the Asmat people of West Papua New Guinea. They live along the rivers and the coastal swamps of the southwest coast of New Guinea, and they were known in the past as warriors and headhunters. These people have a belief system that trees represents humans, and the fruits of the trees represent human heads. So in their artwork, they often celebrate birds that eat fruit because these are headhunting birds in the way that they have believed it in the past. And I will emphasize that these beliefs are no longer practiced by the Asmat people, but did form an important part of their spiritual belief systems in the past. Now, here's an interesting belief that is kind of the anti-Buddhist belief, one could say. They believe that death was always caused by an enemy, either directly, or if someone died of a disease or without an actual attack, then it was an attack in the spirit realm. Therefore, every death required revenge in order to appease the spirit of the person who had died. And revenge often meant taking a head, and this way they could keep a balance in the spiritual world. Now, it's obvious to see that this leads to more revenge and more taking of heads, and it's a very interesting approach to death. I always got to blame somebody, I guess. It's interesting to me to notice how each of these different societies develops its complex belief system, and these do serve the needs of the society on one way or another. Once a person had passed on, they would have a bish carved for them, and that's what we're looking at here, a spirit pole. Now, one of the interesting things is that they also really honored the praying mantis, because the praying mantis bites off the head of its prey once it kills it. Here we have depicted the person who had died, often multiple people who had died, and at the top there's a phallus that represents male fertility. On the bodies of the figures we see carving that represents body adornment. So these would be carved after the person had died. Oh, and when they took the trees down, they would attack them as if attacking an enemy, and then carve them, and then put them up facing a river. so that the spirits could go on across the river and go into the spirit realm and be free. And then these poles would naturally go back into the earth and decompose as an offering to the spirit world. They're remarkably similar to the totem poles that we see in the Pacific Northwest culture, although I do believe that the symbolism is a little bit different here. These polls will mark the end of part 1 of the audio lecture on the peoples, art, and culture of the Pacific Islands. Hey, thanks for listening.